This week, I'll show you 4 ways to get rid of long exposure noise. Generally, there are 2 different types of noise. There's high ISO noise and long exposure noise. In today's tutorial, we're talking about long exposure noise. If you want to learn about high ISO noise, click on the eye in the corner or the link in the description. Long exposure noise is very different to high ISO noise. It's basically lots of hot pixels all over your shot, and they tend to be brighter in the shadows. They're normally made up of red, green or blue pixels, and they really stand out, especially when you try and bring the shadows back. When you leave your camera on and take a number of shots, they'll normally be in exactly the same place throughout those shots. Every now and then, depending on what camera brand you have, the camera will remap the sensor. So basically the pattern of these hot pixels will change over time. Also, if you click on sensor clean in your camera, I think then it also remaps the sensor. So you'll get a different pattern of hot pixels. This isn't so important for certain techniques, but when you're taking a dark frame, it just means that you'll need to take your dark frame at the same time as you took the photographs. But more about that later. So these are the ways to get rid of long exposure noise. There's an option in most cameras nowadays called long exposure noise reduction, and this basically gets rid of these little hot pixels. However, if you're under a time constraint or you're shooting a time lapse or doing star trails, this really isn't an option. When you take a photograph with this setting switched on, you'll have to wait exactly the same time as the length of exposure that you took. So if you've taken a 1-minute exposure, you'll have to wait another minute before using the camera. And this is complete lockdown. The camera won't let you do anything at all. It'll sit there with processing image on the monitor. Now on this first shot, I went down to the marina and I took a long exposure shot. So this one was about 4 minutes. I put long exposure noise reduction on, so I had to wait another 4 minutes for the shot to be processed. If I look at the shot where I don't have long exposure noise reduction switched on, you can see all of these hot pixels in the shadows. And then we go back to the one where long exposure noise reduction was switched on in the camera. You can see all of these hot pixels have gone. So you can see when you have long exposure noise reduction turned on, the camera does a really good job. Dark frames are really well known in astrophotography, but if you've come from the photography side of things, you may not know what they are. It's basically a way of getting a readout from the sensor with just these hot pixels on. It's really simple, but you have to do it at the location where you've taken the photographs for best results. What you basically do to get a dark frame is put the lens cap back on your camera and take another photograph with exactly the same settings. For this example, I've only taken 1 dark frame, but let's say if you are stacking a lot of astrophotography shots, you may want to take a series of dark frames as well. Then a program like Starry Landscape Tracker would then use all of these dark frames and then work out what exactly are hot pixels and what are stars. This is the process of stacking in astrophotography, and I'm going to cover this in a future episode. So by taking a dark frame, you're separating out what are hot pixels and what are pixels that make up your photograph. Once again, for dark frames, I've taken a shot down the marina. I have this shot, which I took over 4 minutes. This was the one where there's noise in that corner and noise pretty much all over the frame. After this shot, I took another photo with the lens cap on, and this is my dark frame. All the settings are exactly the same, just with no light getting into the camera. So to make these hot pixels stand out, I've bumped up my exposure and I've opened up my shadows. What I'm going to have to do before I take them across to Photoshop is drop these levels back down. So I'll go on this one, I'm going to drop the exposure, the highlights and the shadows back to 0. And the same with a dark frame. You can see all those hot pixels, but again, I'm going to take them all back to 0. Now what I'll do is I'll select my photograph and the dark frame, and then edit in, open as layers in Photoshop. Once it's brought them across into Photoshop, make sure your dark frame is on the top, and then on this blend mode, click on subtract, and then save your image. Once it's saved, go back into Lightroom, and then it'll open this new image as a TIFF file. So this is the blended file, and this is the original. Again, if we look down in that bottom corner, what I'm going to do is bump up the exposure and the shadows, so we can really see into those shadows and see what's there. I'll select the other one, I'll sync. Now if we switch over to the TIFF, you can see not all, but most of this long exposure noise has gone. So this was before the dark frame, this is after the dark frame. There are still a few of these hot pixels, but nowhere near as many as there were to start with. So as you can see, getting a dark frame in the field is really worth it. It's a very quick and easy process to get rid of these hot pixels in Photoshop. This is the most tedious way of getting rid of these hot pixels, but sometimes it can be the most effective. So for manual removal, I've got this image here. I did some short star trails above my car. You can already see by the name of this image that I've edited it a couple of times. I blended the image to get the star trails. I think I blended about 4 images. So I've zoomed in on this area where these hot pixels are being quite stubborn. So I'm going to zoom in probably 4:1, and you can really see those hot pixels there. So to manually remove them, go to this tool here, which is the spot removal tool. You want to make it as small as the pixels pretty much. Then literally just click on these pixels. This is a bit of a tedious task, but if you want the best looking image possible, this is what it takes. If the hot pixel falls on a line of a darker and a lighter area, just watch where it samples the image from. As you can see here, it sampled a similar part of the dune. As I said, this takes a long time to do, so all you want to do is be patient, have a cup of tea, a coffee or a beer, and then just plod your way through it. If you use this in conjunction with the next technique that we're going to use, or the dark frames, it'll really speed up the process and you'll only have a few of these hot pixels to remove. If you don't have the patience to manually remove them, you've forgotten to take a dark frame, and you didn't have long exposure noise reduction on, then this is another way to do it. So this is the image that I've got. And you can see there's quite a bit of this long exposure noise in the shadows. So what I'm going to do is right click on the image, edit in Adobe Photoshop. I'm going to edit a copy with Lightroom adjustments. So this is a fairly straightforward way of doing things. All you want to do is click on Filter, Noise, Dust and Scratches. If you get your radius to 2 and then play around with the threshold. With this little preview box, if you actually click and hold on it, it'll show you what the image was like, and then when you let go, it'll show you what the image will be like once you put this filter on. So you can see it's getting rid of a lot of that noise in the shadows. All we want to do is make sure it's not getting rid of too many of the stars, and it really is. So I'll bring that threshold down. Now if I OK on that, you can see this really affects the stars. So if you're doing astro shots, you've really got to watch what you're doing with this filter. And this is why taking a dark frame at night is really important. It's so that the computer can distinguish between these hot pixels and the stars. When the A7R2 came out, there was a firmware that came out that ended up being nicknamed the Star Eater. And I think this is what it was doing in camera. So the way to get around this is to split up the ground from the sky, and then I can just edit the ground without affecting the stars in the sky. First of all, I'll unlock this layer, and then I'll duplicate the layer. So right click, duplicate layer, OK. Then click on this little box here. What I'm doing here is a bit more technical, but if you don't have any stars in your shot, you can just use the dust and scratches filter. With this more advanced technique, it means that I'm protecting my stars and getting rid of all of these hot pixels in the land, the foreground, and anywhere where there aren't any stars. So this is known as a mask. What this does is anything that's white, it will show, anything that's black will not show. So in this mask, I'm going to create a gradient. I'm going to make sure it's selected from black to white. I'm going to hold down Alt or Option and click on the mask, and this brings up the mask. So I've just got to line up the mask with the ground. And that's about right. So now with this top layer, with this mask, all of this white area will be affected by anything that I do to this top layer, and then nothing can be seen on this black area above. So I'll click back on the layer, I'll click on Filter, Noise, Dust and Scratches. Again, you can see when I click and hold, I can see the noise, and when I let go, it's not. But it's not affecting the stars anymore. So I'll click on OK. Now when I zoom in on the ground, I've made that top layer invisible, and you can still see all of this noise around here. When I click back on it, the majority of that noise is gone. Once it's saved, go back into Lightroom, and then it'll open this new image as a TIFF file. So you can see with the original image, we've still got this long exposure noise on it, and you can see that clearly zoomed in on a 1:1 scale. If we go to the one where I use the Dust and Scratches filter, it's a lot cleaner. And when I zoom out, even at this scale, you can see it is a lot cleaner. Now, because I used the mask to block out the sky, the stars haven't been affected. The problem with the Dust and Scratches filter is it can very quickly degrade your image and make it look a little bit strange. So what I try and do is get it just on the boundary of getting rid of most of the hot pixels, and then I'll manually remove the rest of them. And that's about it. This long exposure noise can be really annoying, and if you don't know how to get rid of it, it can ruin your photograph. However, by using at least one of these techniques, you can pretty much get rid of all of that long exposure noise. As always, if you like what you see, give me a thumbs up. If you didn't, give me a thumbs down. And for weekly tutorials, hints and tips in photography and videography, subscribe and turn on notifications. I'll see you next time.